I'm genuinely surprised that 610Hz is actually noticeable. And that is coming from someone who already used a 480Hz OLED, which is already insanely fast. Not gonna lie, I expected not to feel any difference, considering it's only a small jump from 480Hz to 610Hz. But as I spend more time on this monitor and quite consistently getting higher scores on aim trainers, I have to admit, this monitor still has a place in the market, even though it's only for a very tiny group of people. In 2025, saying a 24-inch TN panel still has a place in the market might sound crazy, but right now 610Hz TN at 1080p is still the peak esports setup. I know there's already a 720Hz OLED, but only usable at 720p. I don't think it'll ever be used in real competition since it's too much of a compromise. So for now, 610Hz is the smoothest usable experience you can get. People say there's diminishing returns on the effect the higher you go, and I completely agree. The extra smoothness is getting less noticeable. From 480Hz to 610Hz, I feel it's around 15 to 20% smoother, so if you already have the previous 540Hz or the 480Hz OLED, I wouldn't even think about upgrading unless you're a pro who needs every competitive edge possible. But if you're still on 144 or 240Hz, jumping to 610Hz is a massive upgrade. And I would be surprised if someone legit cannot tell the difference. Tracking targets becomes way easier because you are literally getting more visual samples per second, and everything feels snappier. In real game examples, reading the enemy's movement becomes much easier, and sometimes you feel that the enemies move in slow motion even though they don't. And in my case, I get more kills from holding tight angles, but of course, good ping and fast reaction time matter too. However, if you're already on 480Hz like me, jumping to 610Hz, the upgrade isn't as big. Everything just feels slightly smoother, but that little bump still helps me in some situations where I have to track extremely fast objects. In Valorant, for example, when you're playing against neon sprinting, jumping and sliding around, jet dashes, race satchel, or players jump peeking, the motion looks incredibly clear and smooth, which makes it visually easier to follow. And when you're fighting players on these characters with good movement, you know how frustrating it is trying to hit them. And this benefit also follows in aim trainers. In most tracking scenarios, I consistently get new high scores, not by a huge gap, but this happens in like 8 out of 10 scenarios, which is quite surprising to me. While in other scenarios like flicking and micro adjust, I don't really see a big difference. My scores are still similar compared to when I was using my 480Hz OLED. 0.1 milliseconds response time, it's not as fast as OLED, which can switch pixels in near instant, but throughout my gameplay experience, everything looks clean without any noticeable ghosting in every fast-paced shooter game I play. But for motion blur reduction, the 610Hz TN panel is superior compared to OLED. And I think it's the main selling point of still getting a TN panel over OLED if you are a hardcore competitive player. As long as your PC can push enough FPS, eLMB2 makes a quite huge difference in reducing the amount of blur you see. Here are the UFOs I captured using different monitor settings, and you can clearly see with eLMB2 it has the clearest image. And it translates very well in game when you're tracking fast targets. It's not just smooth but also sharp, which makes it so fun in games with lots of tracking involved. If anyone's getting this monitor, I think there's almost no reason not to use eLMB2. Even though the brightness is taking a slight hit, this panel is bright enough that the trade-off for the extra clarity is worth it. And why is it better than OLED in this case? Since OLED has no backlight and it uses BFI to reduce motion blur, it can only display half the refresh rate, and the already not so high brightness from OLED panels will also take a hit. TN strobing doesn't do that. It strobes at the full refresh rate. This is the one category where TN still dominates OLED for esports players. For a TN panel, the specs are quite decent. You get around 90% coverage of the CIP3 color gamut, 460 nits brightness in SDR, and about 1000:1 contrast ratio. I mean, it's obviously nowhere near how eye-candy OLED looks, but for a TN esports focused panel, these specs are more than enough for competitive shooters. TN viewing angle isn't great, but let's be real. When you play FPS, you're always going to sit dead center. The panel size is 24 inches, the standard esports size at 1080p. It's the same exact design as the previous 540Hz model. The only difference is the monitor stand, which is much more compact, giving you more desk space for mouse and keyboard. Adjusting the panel is easy and smooth, but of course, if you want absolute freedom, using a monitor arm is always the best option. One thing you must consider is that you must have a good enough PC to run 600 plus frames per second to use this monitor at its full potential. And there are only a few games that can reach 610 FPS. Valorant, Counter-Strike, Overwatch, and Marvel Rivals if you turn on multi-frame generation. And the FPS in all these games will still dip below 600, depending on where you are on the map or how many abilities are in play. So if your main games aren't titles that actually hit these numbers, this monitor won't fit you at all. It is purely made for hardcore FPS players. You won't stare in awe because of its visuals. Literally, the only dopamine hit you will get out of this monitor is when you hit nice clips or play better in general. That's pretty much it. Now, the price varies a lot by region. In Asia, I found this monitor for $780 to $900, and for US viewers, you gotta pay extra with $1,000, probably due to tariffs. Either way is very steep for a TN panel in 2025, considering that around the same price range, you could also get an OLED with 360 or 480Hz, which is why the only group of people I can recommend this monitor to are only for pros, whether you're in tier 1, tier 2, or if you're trying to get into the pro scene. Basically, people who rely on every competitive edge they can get. Because in that case, if you're making money and your income really depends on how well you perform, spending that amount to get help you play the best can be seen as an investment, assuming you get paid more as a pro. But for most people, you would get a much more enjoyable experience with OLED monitors. Especially with OLED technology getting better and the refresh rate gap getting closer, OLED is just the sweet spot for most gamers. As for me, I'm gonna stick with OLED. I mean, 480Hz is by no means a slow monitor, and besides playing competitive FPS, I've also been playing more AAA games lately, and I do enjoy the deep contrast and visuals of OLED. But if I were myself 2-3 years ago, when all I did was just grinding ranked 12 hours per day, I would probably choose the extra smoothness over better visual quality. Even though the jump after each upgrade is smaller, 20% or even 10% better is still a competitive edge. But whether that edge is worth it or not will vary between people. In short, this monitor is a good fit only if you're a hardcore competitive FPS player. And for other casual gamers, you would get a more enjoyable experience using OLED, especially when the upcoming OLED monitors are getting more insane.